called "What Will Power the Future?" And I think it's a very good complementary part to other panels that we have. And I hope with your active participation, we will find all the solutions for this. And of course, with the introduction of all the panelists, this will be rather easy. So we have on the panel excellent and knowledgeable people with a lot of experience. Let me start with Ambassador Richard Jones. His current function is Deputy Executive Director of International Energy Agency since 2008. He is a seasoned US diplomat with a lot of experience from Middle East to trade negotiations and energy security. And he had also several challenging posts as ambassador, like from Lebanon, Kuwait, Kazakhstan, and Israel. So he knows, I think, everything about the oil and the gas and the prices there. And I'm sure he will be, in his new capacity as Deputy Executive Director of IEA, able also to forecast some of the future options. The next panelist is Dr. Plinio Nastari, President and founder of Datagro Brazil, which is a leading consulting company specialized in sugar, in ethanol, and serving clients in 41 countries. So I'm sure that he will be able to also address the panel with the example of how a special part of renewables can fit in the future energy mix. The third speaker and panel member is Dr. Doug Arendt. He is Executive Director of the Joint Institute for Strategic Energy Analysis of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And he is specialized in strategic planning and financial analysis competencies, clean energy technologies, and energy and water issues, and also in international governmental policies. So I'm sure that with these three panelists, we will have a lively condition for a lively debate. Now, I will not go into the long introductory statements about what will power the future. I will rather start with some guiding questions that might be of relevance for today. Well, the first obvious is what are the options for meeting our future energy needs, while at the same time respecting environmental sustainability and the need to reduce the carbon emissions if we believe that these are causing the climate changes. Then the second question is, and I'm not sure how many will like to consider this, is the fact that this year we have experienced Fukushima accident, which was a terrible, terrible accident, and to my personal belief was maybe even more shocking than Chernobyl. Not in terms of terabecquerels of radioactive substance that was released, but maybe of the failures that were associated in the thinking before, be it in the regulatory oversight, being with the close connection between the regulators and the operators, being the neglecting the history events of previous natural disasters, tsunamis, and so on. But so in light of Fukushima accident, the question is nuclear power still considered a bridging technology for something new that will come into play? And the third question could be, how can a low carbon future be encouraged in newcomers or in the countries that are starting on a faster track of development? And the last question is connected to the panel on innovations the other day. What is the potential of technological innovations for renewable energy on one side and for energy efficiency? Okay, let me add one more, and that is sustainability. At what level can the sustainability of energy supply be assured? And I will give you one example, my favorite example, which might be skewed, but think about. If one would like to have similar electrical use or consumption in China or in India as is now in the US. US has now, and I will only look into the nuclear side, so very narrow. USA is running about 100 nuclear power plants for 300 plus million people. China has like 1.5 billion. So if China would like to have the same amount of electricity as US from nuclear, they would need to have now 500 power plants, or India 400. And by these, they would get only 20% of electricity. Then, but that's on the optimistic side. Pessimistic side could be if we would like to compare China or India with France. They have about 1 plant per million population. So China would need to have now 1,500 plants operating nuclear, and India 1,200 plants operating. But in that case, they would be good because they would have 80% of electricity from this. So, well, I think these figures at the moment are probably absurd, but anyway, the question is whether can we afford energy worldwide consumption on the level of the most developing countries today. I open the panel, and let us start with Ambassador Richard Jones.
Well, thank you very much, Miroslav. First, I just want to explain a little bit to the audience what the International Energy Agency is. We're an international organization within the rubric of the OECD. We have 28 member governments. We don't have companies or individuals. We have governments as our members. And we are responsible for managing the emergency response system for those governments for disruptions in oil supply. We were founded in 1974 in reaction to the first oil shock, which followed the embargo from Arab oil exporting countries during the Yom Kippur War. As part of our responsibility, we watch very closely energy markets, and therefore we prepare forecasts for those markets. But our forecasts are short-term forecasts. However, if you're really going to promote security, you have to look long-term. So we do look long-term, but we don't try and forecast long-term because there's so many different events that can intrude into a forecast and make it meaningless. What we try and do is pick scenarios which are basically policy-driven and see if we want to achieve this policy, what do we have to do? So it's a kind of we take the goal and then develop the scenario. So when I talk about our projections, these are scenarios. They're not forecasts of what will happen, but what could happen if we design policies to meet certain objectives. So when we talk about the future, the first thing we have to decide is what time frame are we talking about? Future, are we talking 2-3 years? Are we talking 5-10 years? Are we talking further than that? Like I said, we forecast our short-term market forecasts are really about a year in advance. We're just now starting to roll out forecasts for 2012. We don't go beyond 2012, really. But we have an annual publication called the World Energy Outlook where we look at medium-term forecasts that go all the way out to 2035 now, 25 years. We have another publication that goes all the way out to 2050, and we may even extend it further. And that's where we look at new technologies. So those are the levels. We also have to think about what type of energy are we forecasting. Are we forecasting transportation fuels? Are we forecasting energy for industry? Are we forecasting energy for people's homes, electricity, and so on? Our forecasts are comprehensive. We look at all the sectors when we try and develop our forecasts, and we look at the whole world. Even though our members are only 28 countries, we do try and look at the entire world. And we have models. Obviously, the models are better for the countries we know, but we do have models for large portions of the world. And we work very closely with non-member countries to develop data and to gain understanding about their energy economies, particularly China, India, Russia, are 3 of the countries that we focus on that are non-members. So what do we come up with when we look at the future? Basically, you got to first consider the drivers. What drives an energy forecast? The first thing that drives an energy forecast is people. People use energy. So population is probably the single most important thing. So we start with the demographic projection. Right now, the demographics, we're at about a little over almost 7 billion people in the world, moving to 9 billion people probably by the middle of this century. So you're going to see, and an additional 2 billion people is a lot of people, but in percentage terms, that's not particularly rapid growth. I think it's about a 3% growth or something like that. Maybe even a little less, 2.8. But then population growth drives economic activity, and economic activity uses energy. So we then look at, if we're going to have this many people and we want to have economic growth, how much energy do we need? We assume, of course, a certain constant improvement in technology, but in fact, the ratio of energy use to economic activity is fairly constant over time. It's declining slowly, but so what I'm trying to point out is that it's not rocket science, or it's not any mystery how we come up with our numbers. It's basic analysis. When we do that, in the short term, it's very unlikely to see a major change in the energy mix. Fossil fuels will maintain their dominance in our energy mix for quite some time, probably throughout our entire forecasts. But other technologies are gaining, and that's the good news. Miroslav mentioned energy efficiency. We think that's the most important new source of energy for the future, is just using the energy we have more efficiently. All of our scenarios assume the predominance of energy efficiency for saving energy. Not conservation, not doing without, but doing what you do anyway, but doing it more efficiently for energy. Then we look at the available technologies. Oil, although we're using oil at a rapid rate, we continue to find oil. Our reserves of oil haven't really declined in terms of number of years. In fact, right now they're pretty high. They're over 40 years at current consumption of oil. Even though oil consumption is higher than ever, our reserves are higher than ever because we've done a better job in recent years in finding that oil. And once that oil is found, it will be produced because the marginal cost of production is quite low in many cases. The irony is, though, that the most rapid growing source of energy in the world in recent years has been coal. Why is that true? Because of rapid growth in the developing world, particularly in India and China, where you had hundreds of millions of people without electricity just a few years ago. Those countries are both electrifying their countries at a very rapid rate, and that's causing the demand for power to grow, and the cheapest way they can satisfy that demand, the quickest way, is by building coal-fired power plants. It wasn't so long ago that China was finishing a coal-fired power plant every week. They were building 50 power plants a year. And that's really what is driving a lot of the concern on global warming, is because coal is a very dirty fuel and it produces a lot of carbon dioxide. Now, there are other fuels, of course, that are used for electricity. Natural gas is a competition for coal. It's normally more expensive, but in recent years there's been a technological breakthrough, and our forecasts or our scenarios have to take into account technological breakthroughs as well. And when we look at natural gas, we think natural gas is going to start growing more rapidly. It already is growing more rapidly. It will probably pass coal as a source of energy, but it will take some time for that to happen. And that's dependent on the use of certain technologies. The United States has dramatically expanded the reserves of natural gas, usable natural gas, through the adoption of new technologies for exploiting what's so-called shale gas. There are a variety of different sources of it, but basically it's rocks under the ground that has gas trapped in it. And they're using horizontal and special techniques called fracturing the rock to release the gas. There's been a shale gas revolution in the United States, which has caused U.S. prices of natural gas to be half of what they are in Europe, a third of what they are in Japan, simply because the markets are still separated geographically. But therefore, you're seeing a rapid growth in natural gas consumption in the United States. So that's another thing that, particularly in the medium term, will be very important. Oil use is also expanding rapidly because, in addition to electrifying their countries, China and India are also expanding greatly the penetration of fossil fuel-fired vehicles. So the vehicle fleets in those countries are exploding. And once you get a car, you keep it. Cars have long lifetimes. Fossil fuel-fired power plants have long lifetimes. And when you consider that the world's annual growth in energy is only a fraction over a % per annum, it takes a long time to change the capital stock once it's there. And that's why there's a tremendous amount of momentum in the system behind fossil fuels. Now, having said all that, the good news is that in percentage terms, renewable energies are growing the most fast, the most rapid, particularly in Europe, where Europeans Union has adopted very clear, aggressive targets, the so-called 20-20-20 targets to have 20% of electricity generated by renewables by 2020, and to increase energy efficiency. And that's very good. But worldwide, it's a drop in the bucket compared to the fossil fuels, and that gets to the issue of answering your question about sustainability. Sustainability is a very important consideration for many governments, but many governments also have other criteria that they look at. A big one is economic development for China and India. Another one is energy security. That's also very important for China and India, but it's also important for our countries. That's the reason the IAA was founded. Economic sustainability is important, avoiding price volatility and so on. And so for many countries, sustainability, while it's important, is maybe a third or fourth priority. But renewables are a way of attacking that problem. And the fortunate thing is that more and more people are realizing now that renewable energy can also attack the other issues. They can be important for economic development, and they can be important for energy security as well. Because nobody can interrupt the flow of the sun for political reasons, or the power of the wind for political reasons. But they are variable technologies. And so if you want to replace a coal-fired power plant that produces a gigawatt of electricity 24 hours a day with a wind farm, you don't replace it with a 1 gigawatt wind farm, because the wind at best maybe is flowing a third of the time. In fact, a lot of wind farms are only used 1/10 of a time. So to replace a gigawatt of coal-fired power or nuclear-fired power, you have to have 5, maybe 10 gigawatts of wind power or solar power. And both of those technologies take a lot more surface area than a fossil fuel plant or a nuclear plant. And then people complain about that, especially if you want to have a power plant close to a city where the demand is. You don't have a lot of land. Land's at a premium. So for a variety of reasons, probably renewables will have a major role to play in the future, but they won't. We probably won't go to 100% renewables, at least not for a long, long time. So when we look out in the time periods that we look out, we see renewables growing in importance, but we see that fossil fuels will persist. And so this is a long-winded explanation of why, when we look at what you need to power the future, the answer is everything. We need all sources of energy. Every source of energy should be exploited where it has a comparative advantage. And we need to look, we can't put all our eggs in one basket and say that wind is the magic bullet or that nuclear is the magic bullet. And of course you pointed out what would be the consequences if China and India wanted to have as many nuclear plants, and that's a very important consideration. One of the things that we've done recently since the incident at the Fukushima Daiichi plant was say, okay, if this incident leads to a change in policies, and we guess what might be some plausible policy changes, what will that mean for the fuel mix? And the answer is coal wins, and natural gas wins. Renewables don't win worldwide. They may win in Europe, but they don't win in China and India. And so that's the sort of thing that we have to look at when we look to the future. We have to look at the world, not just our own backyard, to determine what's going to be going on. And what's going to be going on, in our opinion, if you don't have nuclear power, is you're going to have a lot harder time meeting your sustainability goals for the world. So what I'm trying to say is these are very complex questions. You've got a lot of different criteria that you have to decide what are the how do you balance these criteria, economic development versus security versus sustainability, and or for that matter, just plain old pollution. And choose the technology which is better for a specific use, whether it be renewable technology, a fossil fuel technology, or a technology like nuclear power. And the final technology I just want to mention briefly so that I haven't forgotten it is carbon capture and storage, which is one way of making fossil fuel-fired power plants like coal and natural gas more environmentally friendly by capturing the CO2 from the exhaust of the plant and pumping it underground before it has a chance to get into the atmosphere. And we project that it will take some time, but starting probably around 2030, 2035, we'll see more and more fossil fuel-fired power plants with carbon capture storage. Of course, that creates new problems because you have to have the place to pump it underground. You have to be sure it's going to stay underground. You have to have pipelines to get it from the power plant to where you pump it. So there are an awful lot of legal and regulatory problems that are caused, not just the technical problems, which are also quite considerable. But that's coming down the line, and that will, of course, in our view, prolong the use of fossil fuels. So I hope I haven't talked for too long, but that's, in general, our look at the world for the next 25, 30 years.
Thank you, Ambassador Jones, for this interesting sum up. We have some, let's say, maybe it's not possible to appreciate all the trends in the future without some kind of graphic aids, but it was assumed that the panel are without the slides, so let's keep it at this level. Let's then turn to another speaker. Why don't we take the views of Dr. Doug Arendt.
Super, thank you. Pleasure to join you. Let me see if I can complement some of the things Ambassador Jones said and also focus back on the 4 questions or maybe 5 questions that you asked, and then add a few reflections relative to some of the themes brought up yesterday by the President, President Turk, that I thought were quite actually appropriate for this particular session, even thinking specifically about energy. I think one of the pieces relative to this question on the options for future energy needs, Ambassador Jones said it actually quite eloquently. All options are on the table. We need to look at them. We need to evaluate their environmental footprints and impacts. There have been a couple of landmark reports that have come out earlier this year. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out with a special report on renewable energy. They're also just about to come out with a special report on extreme events, which actually would be quite interesting to think about the potential impacts of climate on society and energy and other pieces as well to be aware of. But that environmental footprint, in fact, goes beyond greenhouse gases. It includes, for example, and mentioned land use as one, water use, a very critical thing to also bring into our thinking about energy. And in fact, one of the largest challenges going forward, in fact, will be decarbonization of the fossil fuel, particularly electric power fleet, with technologies such as carbon capture and storage, as a stressor on our water system in particular. Typical carbon capture and storage systems today use 2.5 times more water and 1/3 more power than not capturing that carbon dioxide. In a world where water stress continues to grow, that's a concern, and we need to think about that one. But the solution relative to integrating those options, I think, is very important, and that word integration, I think, is very key to think about. In the United States, for example, we've done many studies looking at the evolution of the electric sector in particular, but also electricity with transportation and over the energy sector. And one sees that an integrated solution actually brings much more value than just looking at individual technology pieces. Because most of you, like I and my family, think about power when it comes from the plug, not where it comes from the power plant. But we have to be conscious of thinking about it all the way back from the energy source itself. And we can't, in the meantime, forget about the importance of energy efficiency and making the energy system much smarter. So examples deeply embedded here in Europe, for example, on retrofits of buildings, where it's possible to get 80 or 90% reduction in the energy consumption of a building by doing a retrofit. I work in one of the world's net zero energy buildings. It's a beautiful office building. We have photovoltaics on the roof, on the garage. It is holistically designed with daylighting, very comfortable, and literally it has net zero energy, including all of the heating, cooling, and computational power that's used in the building. These things are very feasible today, and that was feasible at essentially zero additional cost over a traditional office building, and it has no energy costs going forward. So I think, again, that I pull that example forward to encourage us to think about the fact that a new energy paradigm is feasible today, affordable today, but very much a part of the question of where's the political will, where's the social will, and that's a theme kind of goes back to yesterday as well. Reflecting a little bit on the situation with nuclear, which we've looked at and monitored quite carefully, I think nuclear is a very sensitive topic, very nationally dependent, very regionally dependent, and of course the world is well behind the increasing the safety of the nuclear fleet. I think that was the overall response. I think the local response that we've seen clearly come out of Japan and come forward in Japan is much more social consciousness of their energy system. Very uniquely Japanese in that sense, where there was a collective will to turn up the heat over the hot summer, to down dress and be casual dress and turn up the average air conditioner to 24, 26 degrees Celsius, which many people would think is, quote, too hot. But they did that collectively because they actually didn't have the power, and they wanted to have power but not go through brownouts and blackouts and things like that. It's a very different paradigm about how one works together in order to keep the lights on and still maintain an operating and growing economy. On the renewable side, those statistics actually are quite striking, but from a small base. Interestingly, pieces just to add to the puzzle, of all new power that was invested in last year, renewables represented about 46% of the new power generation worldwide. So it's not 2%, it's not 5%. As a cumulative capacity, yes, it's quite small, but of new annual expenditures, nearly 50% of all power was renewables. About $250 billion a year business globally in terms of all investments, all the way from venture capital through to mergers and acquisitions, and fairly substantial. And just to wrap up a comment or so on kind of thinking about yesterday, and I think two phrases came forward to me from the President and the Foreign Minister in particular. One was the inevitability of change. And I think, being in Slovenia, thinking about the commitment goals of Slovenia, the European Union, and many others under the Kyoto Protocol, and thinking more broadly about sustainability, that inevitability of change is there. But the other comment that came forward from the Foreign Minister is the political ability. Kind of reflects back to the comment about power and consciousness, actually, of individuals, to understand where their power comes from, what that environmental footprint is, and become more knowledgeable, but then also express their will in terms of changing that system, recognizing, of course, that the system is very large and very expensive and will take time to change. It's not an instantaneous change like going and swapping out your cell phone and getting a new one. But there's a long road to hoe, but you need to have the direction set and the collective will behind that in order to make those changes. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions and discussion.
Our last speaker here, panelist,
Thank you, Dr. Gregorich, for the introduction. I would like first to thank the invitation of the organizers in the person of Minister Councilor Miriam Mozgan and all the companies that made this event possible. And thank you again for the invitation to participate in the energy discussions here at BLED. I would like to say that today, yes, there's an increasing awareness about the need of renewable, clean, sustainable energy. And I would like to stress the information that Doug brought about the importance and the proportion of the new investments in power production capacity being renewable-based, even though still very small in terms of the stock of capacity available. But I would like to stress in particular what is happening with biomass. Of course, we see developments happening in other areas like photovoltaics, where costs have reduced by about 70% in the past 10 years. Photovoltaics have become feasible in some geographies where you find tariffs which are high enough and where you have sunlight which is strong enough to make it viable. But I would like to focus on biomass, because biomass, I think, is the most democratic form of energy. Biomass in the world accounts for about 10% of world primary energy supplies of around 500 exajoules. Of this 10%, in fact, 80% is non-commercial, which means wood burning and all sorts of burning which are not traded. Only 20% is commercial biomass. And within 20% commercial of the biomass, which is commercial, biofuels account for something like 2 exajoules. Heating accounts for about 3.2, and power for about 4. Well, and what is happening with biomass? How do we see biofuels in this context? Well, we see that the world, as Ambassador Jones indicated, is changing very rapidly in the past decade. We have seen the number of vehicles sold in China rising from 2.4 to over 18 million vehicles per year. We have seen, which is by a factor of 7.5. We have seen in India then going from 0.8 to 3.2 million cars per year, so by a factor of 4. In Brazil, from 1.6 to 3.2 million cars, factor of 2. While at the same time, in the US, it has come down from 17.5 to 11.7. In France, it is stable at 2.7 million cars. In Germany, it's going down a little bit from 3.6 to 3.2. So it's exactly the shift of where the marginal demand is moving, which is causing all this concern, all this awareness. And how still in certain pockets or areas of the world, it's still so small. So let's pick gasoline. World demand of gasoline is 21.6 million barrels a day. US accounts for 9 million barrels a day. The Middle East, the entire Middle East is 1.2. The entire Russian market is 0.6. Well, China is already 1.5. Central and South America as a whole is 1.2. Brazil, only 0.3. And we see that the force or the pressure that this increased drive towards reproduction of the standard of living and the standard of energy consumptions that we find in the Western world into India, China, and in the future in other developing countries will put all this pressure. What have we learned from biofuels as a possible solution? We have learned that if they're based from grain, they're not sustainable. The main case, I think, is the US. Second level case is Europe. We have also learned that if we do it from sugarcane, it can be feasible if it's done on a sustained way. And what we have learned from the Brazilian case in particular is that you can reach very high levels of substitution of energy and fuels occupying very little land. Brazil last year substituted 45% of its gasoline pool with bioethanol from cane, occupying a little bit over 4 million hectares of land. If the whole world would decide to substitute 10% of its gasoline with cane ethanol, it would require 18 million hectares of sugarcane. Well, you know that the world has 13.2 billion hectares. We occupy in agriculture 1.5 billion. We occupy with pasture land 1.2 billion. Biofuels in total in the world today occupy 25 million. But it's mostly grain. It's amazing, but biofuels, for most part, still in the world, are from grain, not from cane. in spite we have the fact that we have 122 countries producing sugarcane. So, biofuels from cane is a good example of showing that it's feasible. It has a parallel impact from the additional use of fibers from cane for production of energy. We have always looked at the US as a role model for having developed purpa 2-3 decades ago as an instrument of promoting energy efficiency to promote the more efficient use of energy. Well, I was looking at the numbers of what has been produced from purpa in the US. Well, the power demand in the US on average is 1,000 gigawatts. Well, purpa has been able to produce over these 2.5 decades 10 gigawatts only of additional power. In 4 years, Brazil, where the energy demand, average energy demand is 53 gigawatts, will have built a capacity from sugarcane, bagasse, and leaves of 9.7 gigawatts. It will also have built a capacity on wind energy of 9 gigawatts. But as has been mentioned, wind is not firm energy. So much better to have thermic from biomass. And we see now a big potential, a big drive into conversion of biomass into biogas. And for me, the most refreshing news coming to Slovenia this year was to see the initiative of this company, Kiter Group, that has inaugurated this large plant of I believe 6 megawatts this week, close to Maribor, to produce biogas from waste farm residues and farm residues. And this is in the direction of what we have seen being developed in Germany, where more than 4,500 plants exist at this moment, and which I think both biomass and wind has given the courage for Germany to decide to phase out nuclear after Fukushima. So I think there is technology available. This technology has improved recently. This technology is accessible because we are not talking about rocket science. But what is lacking is not so much technology, is not so much capital. What is lacking, in my view, is vision. Is vision of policymakers to provide the right environment for investment, to provide the seed incentives for these investments to be made. And what is needed is the regulatory framework that would be interesting to happen, to exist, that would recognize the externalities of this energy for us to get out of this trap of becoming forever dependent on fossil energy. I think Brazil is a case with 45% substitution. The US in itself is a case. The US has substituted already 9.5% of its gasoline with bioethanol. But even the US Congress has concluded that there are limits to how much corn you can use by legislating a limit on corn ethanol and by defining targets for renewable energy that would include advanced biofuels. Unfortunately, advanced biofuels are not happening in the US in the speed that legislators had imagined they could happen. And that's why the Obama administration has decided to promote in Congress proposals to open up the US market for biofuels. And I think the world is waiting in great attention for this to materialize, because it doesn't make any sense for the largest energy consumer to have zero tariffs on fossil fuels and to have prohibitive tariffs on the trade of renewable clean energy. But this is probably bound to be eliminated or to be phased out by December 31st. This will certainly bring a big opportunity for producers in Africa, for producers in Central South America, for producers in Southeast Asia to start producing energy. We should have a decentralized energy production developing, and eventually, or probably, the biggest importing market or export market for these countries is probably going to be China, for the rising demand that they're having. And probably China will be buying this energy not because it's clean or because it's green, but will be buying simply because it's going to be cheaper. It's going to be cheaper because of increased scales that will be obtained, because of increased efficiencies. In Brazil, we have seen efficiencies tripling since the beginning of the ethanol program. In 75, we had 2,000 liters per hectare. Now, on average in the country, we observe 6,500 liters per hectare. And today, with on-shelf technology, Brazil could be producing 9,700 liters per hectare. There is an expectation that by 2025, Brazil could be extracting 13,200 liters per hectare. I'm not talking only about Brazil. Brazil is a demonstration effect. This can be extended to Africa, I hope. It would be, if extended to Africa, a great benefit for local use. We would reduce deforestation. Today, deforestation is happening mostly for cooking, which is a pity, which is, one of the 80% of non-commercial use of biomass. So I think we are moving towards this direction of biomass, which not only produces energy, but also jobs, energy security, energy independence, and economic benefits. I would just finalize saying that Brazil has been perceived recently as a safe haven in the middle of this turmoil, financial turmoil. And much of the benefit has been accounted for the foreign reserves that Brazil has been able to accumulate, today of $360 billion, larger than US reserves. Well, 75% of these reserves have been built by the value of gasoline, which has been substituted by ethanol since 1975, valued at market prices. Thank you.
Thank you, Plinio, for this interesting contribution to put some light on the one sort of renewables, and we have seen tremendous influence it had on Brazil energy mix and on economy. Now, maybe after this first round, let's hear what are the questions from the audience. Please. Could you introduce yourself? And
Goran Zikovic, Slovenian Press Agency. I would have a question for Mr. Arendt. You said 46% of all new power capacities built in 2010 were renewables. I'm assuming this is the investment value. If so, do you have the figure? What is the output value? What is the share of output produced by these new renewable capacities as a share of all capacities built last year? Because I'm assuming this is going to be much lower.
Yeah, I don't have the absolute value in the power sector as a percent of total global power. I can follow up with you on that, but it is smaller. So out of that is the investment value was 46%. The power output, taking into account that a significant amount of that new investment money goes into wind and solar, some into biopower, some into geothermal power, a little bit into new hydro. That average capacity factor, which Ambassador Jones mentioned, that's the number of hours that it produces electricity in a given year, from those technologies could be somewhere between, well, hydro might be 100%, but solar and wind could be 20 to 35 or 40%, depending on how the system is designed. So you would see approximately a third less in terms of output power on average, just a rough rule of thumb on that one.
Do we have some other questions now? Yeah, please, here. Oh, you'll get the mic.
Thank you. Well, now it's clear that we need all...
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Hassan Al-Laythi from Egypt. It's clear that we need all kinds of renewables, traditionals, the nuclear power, everything. And each type of power has its own hazards. And when it comes to biomass and biofuel, for instance, we faced a couple of years earlier that it was one of the main sources of the less supply of food. How we can really try to make the best practices so as to go for renewables without facing problems that will mainly the South will face, not only not the industrial countries, but the developing world. Thank you.
Maybe this is the best for Plinio to start, and then maybe Doug, if you can follow up. Okay, well, please.
Thank you for your question. This is the old food versus fuel debate. And this has been studied a lot in the past 10 years. And the conclusion is that there's very little linkage between availability of food and biofuels production. Except probably for the case of corn ethanol in the US. Today, 42% of corn supplies in the US, total corn supplies, are used for ethanol. And this is probably what is behind the rising price of corn, and therefore the price of soybean, and therefore the price of white and red meat that we have observed in the past decade, where we have moved from an average of $2.50 to $3 a bushel to today's more than $7 per bushel, and probably will not see again prices below $3.50 or $4 a bushel for many years to come because of that. Or until technology on agricultural production picks up, and this technology rises by 2.1% per year on average, or has risen by that much since 1940. The fact that is that biofuels demand has been rising by a much larger proportion, putting pressure on supplies of corn. But what we have observed from these rises of price, however, is that we have seen a blow of new wind for promotion of local agricultural producers all over the world again. One of the greatest damages to agricultural production in poor countries have happened from aid, from food aid. Every time a vessel of grain or butter or whatever arrives free in a poor country, it decimates local production. Well, these policies, PL 480, which were behind this policy, which were designed to support prices in the US. All this surplus has been eaten up by biofuels. Great. Now that prices have gone up, farmers in these countries have, again, incentive to produce. Of course, there is a period in which there is suffering, when people don't receive the aid, when production activities are not organized yet to have this happen. And this is the drama. This is where the problem rises. Long term, however, what we see now is a system that will tend to promote local production on a more sustained way than it happened before. The issue is, has a limit been set to this production of biofuels based on grain? In some ways, yes, by legislation, by regulation. Is there an alternative? Yes, there is. You can do with sweet sorghum, you can do with sugarcane, you can do with elephant grass, you can do with other sources of biomass, not having the impacts on food that would be detrimental. So the answer at the end is that there is an increasing complementarity between food and energy agriculture. And what we have found in the countries that we have studied is that energy agriculture, when developed on a sustained way, has increased, in all cases, food production by a substantial amount. So sustained biofuels production is a ways of increasing food production, not otherwise.
I think that was a pretty complete exposition. I just want to point out that when I was talking about that we need all of the above, and you should adapt to the technologies that are appropriate for your area. And there are countries where you really shouldn't do biofuels. And there are other countries where you should do a lot of biofuels. Brazil's a country where you can do a lot of biofuels. There are a lot of tropical countries where you can do a lot of biofuels. But Northern Europe is not a good place to do biofuels. Most of those crops that have been exploited for biofuels in those areas are really not appropriate. They're not the best crops to use. There are, as the professor pointed out, there are waste crops, or wasteland that can be exploited in some cases. But by and large, most of the places where it makes a lot of sense to produce biofuels are in tropical areas. But they can contribute quite a bit to the world in the long run.
Yeah, let me just add a couple of comments, maybe a little contrast in point. When we last analyzed in detail the situation a few years ago relative to the controversy of food and fuel, the numbers, if I remember them well off the top of my head, were that the increase in global food prices, particularly corn and meats related, was only about 4% related to biofuels. The rest of it, in fact, was mostly related to the increase in oil prices and how those filtered through fertilizer and transport and other pieces of the equation. Now, again, that's not reflective of today's situation, which the statistics as presented actually are correct. There's about 40% of the U.S. corn crop into ethanol today, and so it would need to be looked at. But those are the numbers, if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm totally mistaken. Then you asked a second question, however, and let me spend a minute or two on that, which has been touched upon, but let me address it very quickly and very directly. You asked about best practices for sustainability of fuels, but also of energy generally, but we'll keep it focused on fuels. There were some unintended early consequences of biofuels policies, both in the U.S. and as well in Europe. relative to deforestation, relative to crop rotations, relative to some land use changes that came essentially unexpectedly. And since that point in time, which is now 3, 4, 5 years, there's been a very strong global community on best practices for biofuel sustainability. There are many, many working groups on this. There's a global set of standards and practices which can be followed and adhered to and engaged with in terms of pushing them forward as well. Similarly, I think that there are complementary practices that can be, they aren't active yet, but can be developed for all other energy sources in particular. So you've got the global dialogue on nuclear safety, clearly. But you also have a very growing best practices community on the siting for power plants, water usage, the siting and environmental sustainability of alternatives, including hydro and wind and solar, et cetera. So there is a consciousness working there, and I think it's essentially incumbent upon us all to be aware of those and to participate in them and also to follow them.
Let me add something maybe from here. We had this question, how can a low-carbon future be encouraged in fast-growing economies with rapidly increasing energy demands? And so one of the possible options would be biomass. Yeah, I understand if this is tropics, where we have sun and water, I mean rain, that's fine. But what could be in other places, and what could be the incentives for the developing countries from the developed countries? What could be the recipe, or what could we do?
If I may. Well, I think in China, you know, if biogas could be very well promoted in China. China has a very large agricultural production base, and there's a lot of waste from agriculture being generated. And when you produce biogas, you produce electricity, or you can use this biogas and transform it into biomethane. They could be running buses, trucks, cars with biomethane very efficiently. 0.9 cubic meters of normal cubic meters of biomethane substitute for 1 liter of biodiesel. This is feasible in India. This is feasible in China. This is feasible in Africa. I think what is lacking is probably vision, guidance, objectives set by governments, and that would enable and lead to private investments. But this, I think it's perfectly feasible and could provide a great contribution to energy supply. The fact is that we are using energy very inefficiently, in particular in transportation. The internal combustion engine is a primitive form of transforming energy into movement. We use only 28%. The thermodynamic efficiency of the Otto cycle engine is 28%. The diesel cycle is 32%. The rest is wasted as energy, heat, exothermic reaction. Well, where should we move in? As Ambassador Jones, Dr. Arendt have led, we need new technologies, more efficient technologies. We have seen this picture of the BMW electric car. Probably that's where we are leading to, the electric cars, because the electric engine is basically so much more efficient than the internal combustion engine. And where is the electricity going to come from? That is the issue. It could come from nuclear in some areas. Probably this nuclear energy is going to cost a little bit more after Fukushima as you increase the safety concerns and the safety and the investment required to avoid catastrophes, natural events like that. But it could come as well from things that are in our backyard. And that's why I felt that Keter provided a refreshing air from its plant this week.
Thank you, Plinio, but still let me ask you one further question. Now, so biomass and biogas could be a good source and should be encouraged in fast-growing economies in developing countries. But with limiting resources, would this be also the cheapest way forward? Wouldn't be the dirty coal be cheaper?
I'll step in here. And let me answer the question not from a technological standpoint, but from a strategic standpoint from the society and from the government, which is, and you asked for the cheapest answer. The cheapest answer is actually avoiding the need for the energy, i.e. do more things that are energy efficient, build energy efficient buildings, design efficient mass transit systems, look toward more efficient holistic mobility systems. Mobility I use broadly rather than necessarily automobiles, trucks, trains, airplanes, etc., as well as efficiency along those systems, much as electrification provides. That is absolutely the cheapest, quote unquote, way to go forward, but it's also absolutely critical. Because if you look at where we are, come back to the first comments that Ambassador Jones mentioned about population, GDP growth, and energy consumption. Even though we continue to be more efficient on a per unit of economic activity and have been for many, many years, if you look at population growth going out toward 2050 or beyond, if you look at the projected GDP growth, particularly in India and in China going forward, one could project, very simple math, that the world's energy system would need to double by 2050 or something, or thereabouts, if one did not become massively more efficient. There's essentially a need for us all to collectively put the will together to decouple energy from economic development, to become much more efficient with some of the buildings examples that I described earlier. Buildings on average across the US and Europe consume about 40% of energy. A lot of that is lighting, heating, air conditioning, now increasingly plug loads. To become much more efficient with that, to reduce that by 90 or 95 or even 100% is a significant opportunity and a very least cost opportunity. Similarly in the transport sector, which is also about 40% of our energy. So a little bit more, in some sense, a definitive answer in that sense on the strategy side. On the technology side, again, biofuels, yes, but everything need to come into play. Even if we're more efficient, we still have that increased energy demand growth.
I add a little bit. Yeah, one of the points on energy efficiency that we often make is that the technology is here now. It's not a question of new technology, it's a question of using existing technology. Whereas in some other areas, we still need refinements in technology. And so that's another reason why this is the cheapest solution, is because those technologies are already here and it can be done now, whereas some of the other things will have to wait. But one of the points I want to make quite strongly is with the IEA, we work with OECD countries, but as I mentioned, we also work with China, India, and Russia. And we're pushing on an open door. We don't have to twist their arms. I would say that those governments are at least as receptive to our governments as to looking at renewable sources of energy. For a very simple reason, it's security. And it's balance of payments for India as well. They want to exploit their indigenous sources of energy. And for China, it's industrial policy. They look at these technologies as the technologies of the 21st century, and they realize that if they can master these technologies, they can leapfrog in the development race. And they want to do that, and they are putting lots of resources into this. One of the reasons why I think the statistic was mentioned, I think you mentioned it, that solar cells had dropped 70% in the last 2 years in price. Well, it's because they built pretty big factories in China. Of course, it was in response to German feed-in tariffs. But the people that built the solar cells for the feed-in to go on the roofs in Germany were in China. And they built large factories. Their economies of scale helped to drive down the price. And then they got more because the feed-in tariffs the government officials couldn't keep up with the reductions in price. So the feed-in tariff became a license to print money. And so the demand really took off, and the economies of scale took off. And now China has these big factories. They're going to use them domestically. So I don't think we need to make a distinction between developed and developing countries on this issue. I think a lot of the developing countries are, if anything, even more enlightened than our own countries in terms, maybe for different reasons. Maybe they're not looking at it from a sustainability point of view or a global warming point of view. But the important thing is they're looking at it as something they should do, and they're really are doing it. I met a fellow at lunch who said that, who specializes in control systems for photovoltaic cells. He said their biggest customer is India, not in Europe.
Thank you, Richard. Do we have questions, fresh questions from the audience? Yeah, here.
Thank you. I'm sorry to take the floor for the second time. But again, starting from the idea that each region can have its own resources and to use it in Brazil or North Africa or Southern Europe, and taking the solar energy as in the last 10 years the cost has diminished 70%. How credible and how sustainable to have the solar energy as the main renewable energy, the source of renewable energy in our region? And as this will need a huge amount of initial investment, and this is the difference between the developed and the developing countries. The developed maybe will be able to finance that kind of mega projects, but the developing countries will need a consensus from the Mediterranean Union, or didn't manage due to political reasons. But this could be the idea, the solution for the region and maybe for Europe. How we can manage to go forward for such an obvious, that in my viewpoint, I don't know, of course you are the experts, you can, an obvious solution for the region using the solar energy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Who of the panelists would like to start? Yeah, please.
Yeah, there is a lot of interest in solar technologies for North Africa on a major scale. Morocco and Algeria have both spoken about mega projects. Of course, Europe is very interested in importing power from the region, but also solar energy can contribute greatly to the development of the region. And I think Egypt has also done some work on solar power. I was invited to Morocco in January to discuss with actually one of the governors of one of the regions within Morocco. So not even at the national level, at the subnational level, they're looking at these. And we'll be doing some work with the Morocco Oriental, as it's called in French. I don't know for sure what it is in Arabic, but Maghrebiya Sharqiya maybe, or something like that. But they're very serious about developing a roadmap for the development of solar technology in their region and in the region more generally. And we'll be working with them on that. You mentioned the role that developed countries can play. Certainly straight financing is possible, but also joint ventures are possible. While I was visiting Morocco, besides having meetings with the governor and some of the other officials, they took me to a hybrid power plant. And by the way, that's a very exciting development, in my opinion, is mixing solar, or you can do wind as well, with a fossil-fired power plant. So that when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, you get more efficient power, but you have a fossil plant when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing to sustain things. And they have a hybrid plant where they mix solar power with a gas-fired power plant. And they've used that as a pilot project to gain experience and comfort with the technology. And this plant was developed in partnership with a Spanish company. And the Spanish company is interested because, of course, they were able to sell the technology, but they gained experience too. And this is a model that can be replicated in many parts of the world. And now that the Moroccans have got some greater confidence, this was only, the solar contribution to this power plant was only a couple megawatts. But now they've got confidence in the technology, they're talking about moving to the gigawatt scale, not necessarily in one plant, but in their region. And at the same time, we're working with an Italian company that wants to sponsor a major conference to bring Europe together with some of the countries in this region later this year or early next year, to have a major conference on precisely how we can develop ties between Europe and North Africa to promote solar development in the region, including in Egypt.
A couple of other just quick examples, just to emphasize the maturity of these hybrid plants, the 300 and some odd megawatt solar facilities that have been in Southern California for 25 or 30 years now are hybrid systems. They run on solar thermal plus gas. You could also use biogas as well that could be derived from municipal solid waste. I had a discussion with the blogger yesterday from Egypt who said, well, we have all this waste. You know, what do we do with it? We'd like to create power from it. How do we do that? Is that mature technology? It's very mature technology. It has been across Europe and across the U.S. and many other regions for many, many decades. That's one piece. You did ask also the question around what can we do collectively. Let me be a little bit more specific about the we who of Egypt. Because I think to attract companies, joint ventures, and international investors, there is very much an activity that's the responsibility of the local population and the local government in terms of putting the right environment in place in order to assure those investors and those project developers that their investments will pay back over those long lengths of time. And we've seen some turmoil in the energy markets. We continue to see turmoil in the energy markets, if I can speak frankly, that raise some questions, not in Egypt per se, but generally around some of the risks associated with energy investment and energy development. And I think that dialogue continues to mature and continues to require much more attention to it in order to recognize and provide risk assurance to the investors and to the project developers for their many hundreds of millions or billions of dollars that are coming to the table. So there's a very active role to play, I think, locally.
Thank you. Any other question now? Let me ask then, or maybe come back to be a bit more specific, or with the projections of International Energy Agency and with the national plans that are now, let's say, firm, is this enough to limit global warming?
Sadly, the answer is no. Right now, the current trajectory you're on is more towards about a 3.5 degree increase in temperatures by the end of this century, whereas the international goal that was first enunciated formally at Copenhagen and then adopted in the Cancun Agreement is to keep the increase in temperature to below 2 degrees centigrade. In fact, in terms of the concentration of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, 2 degree target is about 450 parts per million. And we're already in the high 300s. I think we're 385 or something like that parts per million. and there's a lot of momentum in the system, and it is it's becoming increasingly untenable. We're still able to construct scenarios. In fact, one of our main scenarios in the World Energy Outlook is driven by what would it take to have a 450 parts per million to stabilize. Basically, we need to see emissions peaking by 2020, and they're still going up now. So we're starting to get to the point where it will be impossible to meet that goal if we don't start acting now. Yeah.
Well, it was not my desire in a way, but this is exactly what I want to hear. So the next question is then, what kind of trigger is needed to press the alarm button? Who can answer that?
I think we need leadership, you know. We need leadership. And unfortunately, I have to say, being a non-US citizen, you know, we thought that President Obama would provide for that leadership. But it seems that he has got entangled with a number of local issues, you know, in the past few months, and he has lost momentum. In the first 6 or 12 months of his administration, he probably could have done anything he wished. And now, obviously, it's much more difficult. And it's difficult to find today a world leader that would enchant people and provide for the stimulus for change. But as you have mentioned, Dr. Gregorich, we have all the conditions for the alarm button to be pressed already. And the question is, who is going to come out and say, well, let's band together and do something about this?
Would the other two panelists like to comment?
Well, first of all, I agree 100% with what was just said. Unfortunately, any politician, when he comes into office, has a mandate, has a certain amount of political moxie or political power, and he has to choose how to use that power. And in the case of President Obama, he tried to do two things at once. He did try on the issue of energy and global warming, but he also tried on healthcare. And I think he spent a lot of his political capital or political power on healthcare, and that gave his opponents a chance to sort of cut him down to size. And it may in the future be viewed as a tragic miscalculation. I don't know. But what happened, and the question is, what can we do to reinvigorate it? Unfortunately, the alarm button's been pressed for some time, and there are people that don't understand the time horizons we're talking about. And they sit there and they say, well, Chicken Little was saying the sky is falling, global warming, but, you know, I don't see it. It's not that much hotter. You know, and there are still, you know, people in the political process in probably in every country, but certainly in the United States, which I'm most familiar with, that deny that this is something that's likely to happen, despite what you know is a very strong consensus amongst the scientific community, at least among climate scientists. So it's hard to get people excited. I mean, maybe it'll take a major catastrophic climate event, but by then it's too late because of the momentum in the system.
Let me offer a slightly different perspective, kind of reflecting and seeing the ambassadors from two leading examples of countries which have taken stands toward their energy system and toward climate, one being Iceland, the other being Ireland. So congratulations to you and to your populace. And reflect back, in fact, to the main panel from yesterday. And this is very much, I think, a theme that I see that's very consistent between the question of the power of the future as it was interpreted yesterday, the political, geopolitical power of the populace, and the power, i.e. the energy system that we were talking about today. And in fact, through much of the work that I've done and sat on national panels and international panels looking at the available technologies, the cost of those technologies in order to improve or move down mitigation pathways, the questions at hand are not, do the technologies exist? I think we could all agree that we have many technologies and we have the ability to innovate very, very dramatically and reduce those costs, et cetera. But the question is do we have the collective will? And I use the term collective will, be that either political or collective, just a populace will, in order to make those decisions. And so you ask, who will lead? My answer might be, why is it not the population which is leading? Why is not there a Twitter-based, kind of social media-based momentum building for this? And I don't know exactly what the answer is, except for I come back to, the question of how comfortable are we in our world today? Do people understand where their power comes from, where their energy comes from? Do they understand the footprint of it? I would say if you were to take a straw poll in here, probably not a representative of the general populace, but in general people would say it comes from the wall and the plug and the gas station, right? They don't, that's what it's presented to them, and it's become very simple, and you have to thank the engineers and the planners for having done that. But one also asks the question, is it now time to build a new consciousness around energy and environment? And it comes back to really the theme from yesterday, where is the power? What is the power of the future? So I'll leave it with a little controversial thought.
Thank you very much. So on Friday afternoon, we are not heading to the best optimistic views. I don't know which topics or which question I could generate to make the mood better. Maybe there is some ideal question from the audience. No? In that case, I would go to another question, maybe a bit away, looking at the risks of the energy production and maybe associated with new, some innovative ways. And that is, maybe I can ask the panelists whether they can reflect on the challenges lying ahead in, let's say, oil exploration at deep ocean conditions. Now, Brasilia has fantastic fields. I don't know, is it 4 or 5 kilometers down on below the surface? And then, in addition, now Norway, UK, I believe, or maybe USA, made together a deal with Russia to challenge the Arctic area. So, and then, so that's, but we have seen the saga on our TV screens in the Gulf of Mexico last year with the remotely attempts to stop the oil well from leaking. But then there is another also rather new technology that is at least pursued massively by Qatar, natural liquid gas. And also there could be some risk associated, and on the production line, but maybe also some risk associated with terrorist activities. So could you, and of course, not to mention the risks of nuclear or the risks of just simple coal coal mining. Could you reflect on these new risks?
Okay. Since you mentioned Brazil, then I'll start. Today, Brazil is extracting 2.2 million barrels a day. And with pre-salt, which has been discovered recently, the forecast is that by 2015, Brazil will double that to 4.5 million barrels a day. And it's going to be the fifth or sixth largest producer of oil then. And yes, it's at 6 kilometers, not 4 nor 5, but 6. And as you know, each 10 meters of depth is 1 atmosphere. So we are talking about 600 atmospheres. So imagine the requirements and the specifications on all the materials, tubes, valves. And Petrobras is in the forefront in the world in that technology. And we are actually praying that things go well, essentially, because if there's a leakage at 6,000 meters, it's going to be extremely difficult to do something there. But that is the essential thing of where we are going to. Is that basically all that is left for oil? Of course not. As has been mentioned, there's ample oil reserves. The thing is that the marginal supply is coming from these very difficult areas. And I think for that reason, we are going to move into gas because there's ample gas reserves, shale, and coal. If we don't want to get trapped into fossil fuels, we have to be adamant and we have to insist in other forms of renewable, in forms of conservation. But that's what is left, and that's the risk.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned coal, because in fact coal is probably the most risky risky source of energy we have in terms of the deaths from mining, in terms of the health effects due to the pollution over the years. Lead levels in children in California are rising because of coal-fired power plants in China. I mean, the fact is that once the pollutants get in the air, they travel a long, long way. And so coal is probably the most dangerous technology. We look, of course, askance at nuclear because there is a potential, I suppose, for nuclear for contamination and so on. We look at underwater oil because of the example of the spill that took place in the Gulf of Mexico. But every day in and day out, coal is the most risky technology for humans, and it's likely to continue because it's a resource that almost every country has. It's a widespread resource, so it's also one of the most secure forms of energy, and it's an old technology. People are used to it. They're comfortable. You read, oh, there was a coal fire. No, there was a mine cave-in. Those poor miners. But it's abstract for a lot of people because it's been ingrained from your very beginning because it's an old technology. And it gets back to the question of how you can balance all these different criteria. Coal is good because it's secure. It's bad because it's risky. But the risks are small. We don't think that there's going to be a coal catastrophe because it's not like oil. It doesn't spread on its own. It'll just sit there. Maybe there'll be a methane explosion or something like that, but you don't think of it as a major risk because it's a small and continuing risk. Whereas nuclear, you think of as a big risk because you think it could be a nuclear explosion. I mean, in fact, I don't even know if it's possible to have a nuclear explosion from a nuclear power plant, but you can have an explosion that certainly releases radioactivity. And that can spread, and that's scary for people because it's invisible, and you may be affected and you don't know it, and so it's difficult to assess the risks. And oil is somewhere in between the two. So, you know, your perception of the risk is one of the factors that has to be brought into this calculation of deciding which technologies you want to go with. It may well be, I mean, people were concerned after the Macondo disaster in the Gulf that maybe the world would abandon offshore oil. And since most of the oil being found today is offshore oil, that was quite a concern for the industry. But in fact, not too many projects have been canceled. There was some delay in the U.S., in the Gulf, but even in the U.S. we're moving forward again. And in fact, the scientific studies now are suggesting that the mitigation of the oil spilled from the Macondo disaster proceeded at a much faster rate than anybody expected. Those microorganisms in the environment had a field day, and they really did chew up a lot of the oil. So, you know, all of a sudden people are saying, well, you know, maybe we should continue to try and go offshore, and, you know, Brazil is certainly not going to be deterred. So the development is going to occur. There'll be calculations made, but the final point I want to make is that what governments need to think about is how do they internalize those risks, because right now the assessment of the risks are being made by the companies whose job it is to produce that asset, you know, that resource. And as long as they're making the calculations of the risks, which side do you think they're going to err on? And, you know, that's where you might want to think about, you know, if the governments want to internalize costs, you know, maybe they need to think about internalizing the direct environmental costs that are more proven than the global warming costs, which are more abstract for a lot of people politically.
I see. Another question, please. The mic.
Thank you. It's again concerning the risks, and after concerning the nuclear energy. I think less than 2 years ago there was kind of acceptance of the reality that the world would need nuclear energy so as to supply a big portion of the needs. And after Fukushima, I assume after the decision in Germany phasing out of nuclear energy and maybe the delay in plans of countries to opt for nuclear power, I think this will have a tremendous effect on the supply and the other resources. I don't know whether it is clear by now what kind of shift after the decision in Germany, for instance, in this similar direction. In some countries, France, for instance, 80% of the power from nuclear resources, more or less. So what can such tendency could affect the world energy? Thank you.
So I tried to mention this just a little bit in my opening comments, but the situation with nuclear is very country dependent. I would hesitate to read a general tendency, except for increased awareness of some of the risks and risk assessment procedures that we talked about before. Going forward, and that's a general. That's very specific to nuclear after Fukushima. There's been reassessments globally. Many countries put plant construction on hold, but have restarted it, again with new security and new risk assessment procedures in place and new requirements in place. But the German decision was very specific to Germany in a different set of consequences. More importantly, take the prior conversation around oil spill, offshore oil drilling, natural gas and shale gas development is very active in the United States, perhaps a little less so here in Europe. But that has risks associated with it too. It's got water risk, it's got underground fracturing risks. And similarly, even wind and solar have risks per se associated with them, perhaps of less consequence than some of the other ones. And someone has to look at then the awareness of the probability of an incident. Might it occur? If so, how often? And the impact of that incident. And I think that's what Ambassador Jones was implying relative to the relative differences between the perception of a nuclear accident and the perception of coal, where it turns out, if you look at the numbers, coal has much more detrimental impacts on human health locally and globally than nuclear has over its lifetime. But the perception of risk is very, very different. And that's true for all of those technologies. And again, all of the technologies in front of us, except for efficiency, have their own intended or unintended consequences. And I think what we need to do is just be much more conscious of it and much more aware and ask for those assessments, actually ask governments to play their role in those assessments and share that information with the population so that they can make more informed decisions or inform the decisions more accurately.
Thank you very much. Let me add just briefly, and then we will try to have a closing presentation or whatever, closing sentence. In addition to Germany, of course, also Italy went into referendum, and so they will not build nuclear for now. Swiss also probably will not. But the other projects are at the moment ongoing, as Doug said, and there are about close to 60 nuclear power plants in construction right now. But to put in perspective, this is very little. And it's a droplet in the ocean towards, let's say, if this would be used as a panacea for climate change. Because you should remember that in the 84 and 85, there were 33, 35 nuclear power plants connected to the grid yearly. Now, there were none, or 2 or 5 last year. And with this pace, this is totally marginal at the moment. But let me give the opportunity to our panelists for the closing sentence from the panel, so that then we can enjoy the final closing of this year Bled Strategic Forum.
Thank you. Well, I would just like to close stressing that we still, as a society, as a global society, are wasting energy, pretty much. Solutions are going to be local. There's not a solution which would apply to countries or regions across the board. For countries which have the benefit to have enough natural resources, biomass can be a contributor to the process. We have seen examples of that happening already, and I think more vision, more leadership is needed for policies to be implemented, establishing appropriate regulation, appropriate legislation to enable these new forms of energy to take place, and for private investments to materialize.
Just want to leave the thought that there are no good or bad forms of energy. They just all have different pros and cons associated with them. And some will be used in some situations and some should be used in others. I certainly agree that we need to use energy more efficiently and more wisely. I also think we need to develop cleaner forms of energy. Certainly some of the renewable energies, biofuels, and wind and solar, not only are cleaner, but they're also more secure, which is a criteria which I mentioned is important to our member governments. It's important to other governments in the world. I think that they can also contribute to economic development, because too many people in the world today don't have access to any modern form of energy. Right now, the estimate that we calculate is 1.4 billion people in the world lack regular access to electricity. And if you want to include cooking fuel, the number goes up to about 2 billion that don't either have access to electricity or to cooking fuel. So there's a tremendous need there in the world among poor people for greater energy. So the world's demand for energy is likely to continue growing, and we need to develop energy solutions. I hope that what you've heard today builds your interest and you do get involved, because governments won't get involved unless they feel that it's an issue that's important to their population. That's what you've seen in the United States. I think President Obama personally is very concerned about these issues and certainly wanted to do something about it, but he's been distracted by the burden of governance. But you as individuals can, if you want to, can get involved and you can help. Thanks.
Yeah, just maybe two more thoughts. The first is, and we didn't spend a lot of time talking about it, really the connection between energy and innovation, energy and entrepreneurialism, which I think is enormous. We've looked and seen large growth in the clean energy sector, in particular in the United States, but also globally. I mentioned some of the investment numbers. Those costs have come down, not just solar, but all of those 50, 60, 70, even 90% over the last 20 years, and projected to continue to decrease. So there's a lot of room for innovation, not only, I'll call it on the technology side, but include software, include information technology and energy technology together, an enormous upside, as well as on business models. And I think to the ambassador's point in terms of energy access, let me complement that with the statistic which I find troubling as well, which is that about 2 billion people also lack access to safe, potable water around the world. And one of the primary first uses of energy could in fact be for water provision, both for pumping but also for purification, which would relieve an enormous burden on particularly the women and children in those countries where it is not of easy access. That leads, of course, to next year's Year of Sustainable Energy underneath the UN. So it's one of the primary pushes next year. And I hope that major accomplishments are made. But I think that while we touched on a number of challenges, I think I'd like to leave with the glasses quite half full. There's a lot of innovation happening. There's an enormous upside. The markets are large. There's a lot of innovation and an opportunity for all of us to make a difference.
Thank you very much. Let me then close the panel by going back to the original questions that we have, not trying to sum up what was told by the panelists, but let's say on what are the options for meeting the future energy mix, I think future energy needs, I think that the answer was quite clear. Full energy mix is needed of coal, of gas, of oil, of nuclear, of renewables, and energy efficiency. Then, after the Fukushima accident, is nuclear still considered a bridging technology? Well, we have not, apparently yes, we have not seen any drastic changes in planning. But, of course, it will be even more expensive to invest because of the additional safety and security measures may be put in place, and during the operation probably because of the higher oversight. Then how can a low carbon future be encouraged in fast growing economies? We have seen that with joint ventures, with know-how transfer, there is plenty of opportunity in the area of biomass, in the area of biogas, in the area of other renewables, like in many climate areas, in photovoltaics or in wind turbines. And with respect to the question on what is the potential of technology innovations, also there is quite a lot of potentials, and as it was seen in particular in renewables, again, we could say efficiency is also there, but there is plenty of work done on wind turbines and on different solar systems. But I think also it was mentioned that carbon capturing storage is one of the options for the future, and for that I think we will need quite a lot of technical innovations and proofs. Last but not least, we have identified that our hearing system, collective hearing system, is bad, and we need to clean the ears, because apparently alarm is on for some time. The governments the politicians, of course, they objectively cannot lead, because they first 2 years they are busy with so many different plans, and the next 2 years they are running for re-election. And so maybe some motivation will come from the next year, UN year of energy sustainability, and I'm sure some alarms will ring there, but also maybe the secretariats of OECD, International Energy Agency, of World Meteorological Organization, of other UN entities, other UN institutions, and NGOs, maybe they could get more active to show that alarm is on. With this, I would like to thank Dr. Doug Arendt, Ambassador Dr. Richard Jones, and Dr. Plinio Nastari for the panel. Thank you.